Well, hello everyone, and welcome to something we are calling Speeding Through History, a new video series which I am launching with the help of a number of people, including our guest here. By way of introduction, my name is Jim Zufall. Some of you remember me as the announcer at Pennsylvania Motor Speedway for a number of years. My journalism and motorsports roots go back to 2001 with Motorsports Fan Report magazine, Linda Fennell's Motorsports World, Dirt America, Dirt Track Digest. I was a member of the car radio program on KDKA for a few years, and for nigh on 3 decades, or in my third decade now, of being a member of the radio program, now podcast, Rapping on Racing. And our guest is the brainchild behind that. We're going to talk to Don Gamble about a whole lot of things, mostly racing history, and that's what Speeding Through History is all about. Don, you know my interview style. I don't do a lot of how you doings and welcome to the show, so we're going to get right into it. And for that, I'm going to summon a teenage Don Gamble and ask him where this all started. Where did this passion come from?
Well, first, I'd like to thank you for doing this. I know that you and Rich Morganti said that we need to record some of these things that I remember while I'm still here. So, a teenage Don Gamble, we'll start when he's 13 years old, lived in Greenfield. And one of the heroes of the Pittsburgh Racing Association was Buddy O'Connor. So, I'm on my way home from school and his race car's in the yard. And I decided I'm going to climb in this car. Now I'm liable to get my butt kicked, but I want to see what it's like. So I get in this car, and that was it. I mean, that was the beginning of the history. I fell in love with it. And I convinced my dad to take me to the closest track to where we lived. And it was in Export, PA. It was Monduke Speedway. And after that, my my destiny or my future was set. You know, we went there in 1955 and saw some really good racing. Dick Linder, Herb Scott, Buddy O'Connor, Joe Mihalik. It was like stock car heaven. And here it is 80 some years later, and I'm still doing it.
Well, this is great. And not only are you doing it, I can't, there's no way to count the number of people that you have impacted down through the years. I put myself in that category as well. I mean, I wouldn't be doing any of this if it wasn't for you. I mean, I started off writing for a little paper, and one day I came to you and said, "Hey, you need a voice that's got a little bit of radio experience. Let me know." And that's how it all started. I say 2001, 2002, back that way. But anyway, so this is sort of the thing we want to talk about. You mentioned Monduke. Let's start there. I want to hear about some of the old speedways that those of us, and I'm not, I think I'm 18 years younger than you if I have my math right, but there's a lot of speedways that I was either too young, wasn't paying attention, or just simply wasn't around for, and I think Monduke is one of them. You say it was in Export. Tell us about Monduke Speedway.
Well, it was a wonderful speedway. The seating was on a hillside. All the bleachers were on this hillside, and you could see everything. And it was just good racing. I got to race there a couple times before it closed, but now it's a nursing home, which is kind of disappointing. So if you're going through Export and you see a nursing home with a big hill behind it, that's Monduke Speedway.
So the names you mentioned racing at Monduke, and again, I know you started out life in that area out that way. So these are the guys you mentioned, you Buddy O'Connor and Herb Scott and so on. How old were these guys at that time? And we're going back a long way. I mean, most of them are gone. All of them are gone now. But would Herb Scott be 100 years old now? Maybe I don't have any idea. But how young were these guys then?
Well, I'm guessing most of them were in their 30s at the time. Yeah, they weren't kids, but they weren't real old when they were racing there.
And racing then, I don't want to say the same as now. The decades have passed, everything's different. But it was a sideline just like it is now. Nobody was racing professionally. Is that correct?
Well, not really. Herb Scott was racing 5 nights a week, sometimes twice on a Sunday. Now, keep in mind, in the PRA back in the '60s, Witzberger was paying $500 to win. And in those 6 nights, Herb probably won 3 or 4 of those. So
Wow.
he was making a good living doing this. Now, and some of the other guys, now Linder, he was racing as much as he could. Uh, Mihalik, the same thing, O'Connor. But then a lot of the other drivers that they competed with, maybe they only raced at Monduke and it was a hobby. But keep this in mind. Witzberger's paying 500 to win. You could build a car, a competitive car, for about $500.
You can't buy a tire for that now.
Yeah, so you win one feature and your car's paid for.
So Monduke's one of them. You said he raced 5 nights a week. Where else?
Well, he would have raced at Heidelberg, Little Washington. Told you about Monduke. I think for a while, Butler was part of the PRA, and and Claridge. Claridge was another part of the PRA. So they had a lot. I remember when I was a garage rat at Bill Sachs, he would ride me to the races. First, he was riding me in the back of his pickup truck. And then I got graduated to be able to sit in the race car when they towed it to the track. And I remember, and I think it was a Sunday that we went to like Little Washington in the afternoon and South Park or Heidelberg that same night. A lot of racing.
You mentioned Claridge. Where was that?
Um, I'm trying to describe where it was at. It's now a soccer field, and when I lived in Delmont, it wasn't very far from there. But I don't know what town it was in.
Okay, but east of Pittsburgh.
Yeah,
I hear names like South Park. You mentioned Butler. Now, Butler Speedway is now the site of Butler High School. Is that correct?
that is correct.
Yeah, I know Walt Weimer talked about Butler Speedway pretty
Yeah.
often. When did Butler close?
Well, what happened was it was running on a Friday night, and Don Martin was running Lernerville on a Friday night. Well, to eliminate the competition, he bought the contract and closed Butler Speedway.
Wow. We mentioned Herb Scott. Pick out another one of the drivers you mentioned, and let's talk about them one by one. Where they came from, what they drove, let's talk about how well liked they are, because let's be honest, some race drivers, especially exceptionally successful ones, they're not always the fan favorite.
Well, I was not a fan of Herb Scott early on because he was winning all the time. And I remember at South Park one night, the races were over, and I'm walking down to go in the pits, and he's right there with me. And I said, Mr. Scott, I said, does it bother you that half of the people here are booing you? He said, well, their money's green, and I'm taking a lot home. So no, it doesn't bother me. But I later on got to be very good friends with him and was uh, partially instrumental between myself and probably his son Deke. We got all the paperwork together to get him in the Dirt Racing Hall of Fame.
I got to meet Herb Scott as many people as I do with many people, sadly, way too late in life. As you know, I was involved with the Wexford Starlight Car Cruise for a number of years, and of course, Herb being from Wexford, his racing days long behind him. He was into street rods and antiques and whatever, and he would bring a 19. I want to say I'll check with Deke on this. I think it's a 1939 Ford convertible he would bring every night. And when people started to understand who this guy was, thanks to me, I was one of the only people that realized who this Herb Scott guy was. We gave him preferred parking. And after he passed, we had a ceremony for him and we unveiled a bronze plaque, which I think is still in Deke's possession. Again, as a guy I wish I could have known much, much younger in life. But talk about some of the other drivers from that era.
Well, Ed Fiola was a popular driver, and his brother had a restaurant down in, I think it was Trafford. And the restaurant was adjacent to the railroad tracks. And, you know, racers have a lot of friends. And sometime when a train was coming through, there'd be a lot of pipe thrown off the train behind the restaurant. And that's where most of the roll cages came from. But Fiola was interesting, big, tall guy and a good racer. And there was one time, Don Dale was pretty mischievous. And there was a time, and I guess Don lived up somewhere around the Clarion area, and there was a bunch of them up there having a couple of adult beverages. And I don't know what precipitated the problem, but they took a chain and wrapped it around Fiola's rear end in his regular car. So after the festivities were over, when he got in his car to drive home, it ripped the rear end
Oh my goodness.
right out of his car. There was some hard feelings there for a long time. And another one is Don Dale. What a driver. I mean, he drove in everything. Well, I don't, he was never in a sprint car, but just about anything, like the old coupes, very successful in all of them. One of the things I liked about him, he was creative. In the PRA, there was a time when you got your number by where you finished in your point standings. And most of the time, Herb was one, but then there was a year when he was a zero. But whatever number was on the car, like the one I was sitting in, it was Buddy O'Connor's, was 6. So that meant that the year prior to that, he finished 6th in the points. Well, Dale was kind of partial to the number W2. They said, you can't use that. All right. So he numbered the car 121. But the first one and the part of the 21 was a W2.
Nice.
So he had a way to beat the system. But Witzberger was tough, but a lot of heroes were created during his tenure as the Pittsburgh Racing Association.
So let's step away from drivers for a minute. You mentioned Ed Witzberger, and I think a lot of these are the guys whose shoulders we're standing on now, and the drivers that are active now. Part of the reason we're doing this Speeding Through History series is to understand where we came from. And I say we, I'm never a driver, but the people that are driving now, the team owners, the racers, they have to understand the history, where this all came from. And Ed Witzberger, my goodness, he wrote the book on it, did he not?
Yes. Yes, he was way ahead of his time. I mean, early on, he on a race night, he would give each driver a couple's ladies' passes to get the family in, and he just, like you said, was way ahead of his time.
How did he? You said he was tough, but fair. How did he treat the drivers?
I thought he treated them well. Unless if you ticked them off, you had a problem. They had a rule for a while that if you raced somewhere else, you were banned from PRA for 2 weeks. Well, like Herb, he'd get down to West Virginia somewhere to race under an assumed name, but someone would get back to Witzberger. So that didn't work out too well.
Not only a trendsetter, but a pretty smart guy, I take it, Witzberger.
Yeah.
So, all right, we talked about a few drivers already. As they come to mind, Don, please just jump in and say, "Oh, this guy or that guy." Let's be honest. We're talking about a real cast of characters
Oh,
back in the 50s and 60s, and you mentioned an incident with the rear end being torn out of somebody's car. I'm guessing that after the races, a few adult beverages might be involved, and I would think some shenanigans went on.
shenanigans is putting it mildly. Yes. But, if somebody had a problem, they would help out. Now, Herb Scott and Joe Mihalik were arch rivals. But Herb rolled a car over. I think it was at Monduke. And you can clarify that with Deke. And it was destroyed. So guess who helped build the new car? Joe Mihalik. Yeah. And the wives were funny. I mean, Pat Scott and Mihalik's wife and all that. They had a group that always sat together, did things together, fundraisers together, and their famous saying was, "Let the boys play. We'll still be friends." So if Mihalik took Herb out in one of the races, it didn't have any impact on the friendship of the wives.
Well, that's saying a lot.
It is.
We've all seen, and especially you look at the days we're talking about, women weren't allowed in the pits. That's correct, right?
Right. Right.
So I think you and I have been privy to a couple of incidents in the pits where where the wives and daughters and whatever are there, and sometimes their temper's a little more fiery than the drivers themselves.
Yes, they can instigate a lot of problems that don't have to manifest themselves there. But I want to back up a little bit. This was at Monduke, and there was a Potter Puff race, and Pat Scott was winning the race. And there were two of the ugliest women you ever saw came out and got in the race, and one of them spun her out. Well, when they got to victory lane, they figured that the two ugly women was Herb Scott and Don Dale.
Oh my God.
So there was a lot of people sleeping on the couch that night.
Oh my. So again, shenanigans and fun times, and a couple of tracks, Pittsburgh being one of them, has tried to bring back a race or a kind of a race that I've only heard about in the past. There's a couple of names for these races. I've heard a helmet dash.
Right.
I've heard an Australian pursuit dash.
Right.
Expand on those. What are we talking about when we talk about those? Because I don't think anybody runs them regularly anymore, right?
Well, when Heidelberg was running the helmet dash, they'd take the top three cars from the previous week's feature and they'd line them up, three right beside each other. And there was a night when Scott Mihalik and O'Connor were racing. And if you didn't know better, you would have thought the three cars were bolted together. But then on the last lap, somebody would move up and win the race. Now, the Australian pursuit race, you take 10 cars and they'd line up fastest in the back. And if someone passed you, you had to drop out of the race. There was a situation at Blanket Hill one time when Blackie Watts started 10th, and he passed the whole field on the first lap.
Wow.
And when he pulled into the pits, Joe Pitcavish says, "Way to go, Blackie. Don't wear out the equipment."
Right. Perfect. So some of the other tracks you mentioned Blanket Hill. Blanket Hill's gone through a number of incarnations down through the years. They're primarily what I would call a small car track now, although I do believe they're racing some version of a hobby stock or pro stock or something these days, big cars. But some of the other tracks that are long gone, Hickory is gone. I never made it to Hickory. Tracks that had actually been dormant for a while. Mercer was one of them that had sat dormant for a number of years, did it not?
Which one?
Mercer.
Mercer maybe a little bit, but Hummingbird was dormant for 25 years.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. And Louis Calderon, he brought it back. And Dave Oliveri and I spent a lot of nights up there, and good racing, good people, and good crowds. Because if you live up where Hummingbird is, there's not a lot of other social activities that you can participate in. So it was perfect. And they're still running. And Louis, I think Louis in his 90s, and he's still running the show. And they respect him. They listen to him. He goes around in a golf cart, and when Louis starts talking, everybody starts listening.
One of the tracks that's been around forever, and again, it was shuttered for a time as well. One time known as Schmucker Speedway, now Latrobe Speedway.
Right.
Been a couple of different locations. Am I right on that?
Well, no. The old Latrobe Speedway was in Latrobe, and it was adjacent to a water treatment plant. And eventually, I guess the racing was taking up too much of the property and whatever, and they shut it down. But there's a group of guys named Shirey that every year has a reunion there, and the whole track's not there, but part of it's still there. And some of the best in the business will go there and just participate in a racers reunion. They do a wonderful job with that. Well, then Schmucker Speedway was built by Paul Schmucker across the road from a farm he had. And it's still there. It's had a lot of owners come and go, but good racing up there at Latrobe.
I'm guessing a lot of the tracks, and I'm thinking, I assume was there a South Park Speedway? Do I have that right?
Yes, it was across the road from a drive-in theater there, and it was owned by Levitsky Brothers, and they didn't like the track being there because on a Saturday night, it was kind of noisy, and people would raise hell. So finally, they were able to shut it down. But the funny thing about South Park, and now we're talking about guys towing their cars, we call it flat towing, where the car was on the ground. Well, one of my jobs as a grunt with the Vilsack team is when you'd get there, the pickup truck pulling it maybe couldn't get you up the hill. So you'd fire up the race car and you'd actually push the tow vehicle up
Oh
the
my,
hill. Yeah.
nice. So South Park fell to what we call urban sprawl, I guess.
Yes.
Any other tracks you can think of that? Now, I would have thought this of Butler, but Butler had a different reason for it, as you already explained. Other tracks you can think of that kind of used to be in the middle of nowhere, and then, the nowhere went away when all the housing and development showed up.
Well, Clare Ridge was another one like that. It got to a point where the property where the track was more valuable for other things, where the track promoters couldn't sustain it. They couldn't, like okay, when Columbus Motor Speedway was sold, I was at a RPM workshop in Florida, and I was sitting with the owner there, and I said, why are you one of the most successful tracks in America? Why are you selling it? He said, Don, there was so many zeros on that check, we couldn't turn it down. And they got millions for it.
Well, I get that. As long as it's attractive property. You think of, nowadays, what Lernerville opened in 67, 68. Not much going on out in South Buffalo Township in those days.
Right.
Look at it now. I mean, there's
Yeah.
housing developments. Every time you turn around, there's another housing development going up out there. Pittsburgh's not a whole lot different. There's a ton of development happening out there, not all housing, a lot of it industrial development, but the housing that is there. And of course, the joke at Pittsburgh, and I'd like to let you talk a little bit about the Heidelberg to Pittsburgh transition, but the joke at Pittsburgh is, you move out there, you got to know there's a racetrack there, and you got to be a total dope to not understand there's an airport right there. You
Right.
want to not complain about the noise, please? I mean, you already knew what you were getting into.
Yeah. Sometimes people don't think. I want to go back to Heidelberg, and that's another example where they had to sell it. That property was so valuable. And in the later years, like Tommy Kalala promoted it for a while, but they just couldn't keep up with the offers. And the people that owned Heidelberg, they just had to sell it.
Well, it becomes a place where, yeah, it'd be crazy not to,
Yeah.
because we all know this. I mean, talk to any promoter. You promoted what Motordrome for a little while. You didn't exactly, I don't know how much of the financials you were doing, but you understand none of these people, and I don't want to say guys because a lot of it is families. A lot of these families that own these racetracks, they're not in it to get rich.
Right.
Everybody says it, in any form of racing, you want to be a millionaire, you better start out a billionaire.
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty much. Yeah. It's just, it's a sad situation. But as development progresses, there's only so much land around.
So I want to talk about, and I think we're going to continue this. We're going to try to do this speeding through history series in 30-minute segments. Just people don't have a lot of time. We're going to try to do it that way. I want to finish here today by doing something we could have done at the beginning, but I didn't, and that is to properly introduce you and your credentials. We talked about the teenage John Gamble sneaking into a race car, but you have a saying that you've won everything but the 50-50, or you've worked everywhere but the concession stand. Well, I'm going to guess you probably worked a concession stand.
A couple
Let's talk
times.
about you. Have you ever been a flagman?
Yes.
Okay,
At
so go
you
ahead.
want to hear the
No, go
story?
ahead. Yep, yep, yep.
At North Hills Raceway, Jack Freeman was the flagman and he had back surgery. Well, Don Hafner was the promoter there, and he said, I don't have a flagman. I said, well, I've been around long enough. I could probably do this till Jack is healed up. So they put me on the flag stand, and because I knew how drivers think and some of the tricks they would try to play, occasionally I'd get the black flag out. Well, I black flagged this one team, and the guys that owned the car were both bigger than me, and they were mad. And Don Hafner had a trailer in the pits. That was his office. So one of them come in, and they were going to, I think, I'm mixing up my stories. I think it was Butch Skiles who was dating Don's daughter. He came in to offer his opinion, and the trailer's rocking back and forth, banging, and all kinds of noise. Skiles comes out. He looks like he was hit with a dump truck, and he said, "Problems all solved."
Yeah, nobody wants to know what happened inside that trailer.
No.
So, okay, Flagman, you were a promoter at Motordrome Speedway for a year or two, were you not?
1 year, 1 year at Motordrome.
What
Yeah.
was that like? Was that eye-opening for you to
Oh
be on
boy.
that side of it?
Yeah. Well, what happened? There were six people that were going to buy the track, and Danny White actually had two shares. So it was him and would be three other people uh, that wanted to buy the place. And uh, Rob Arsenberger asked me if I would be interested in coming there to work. And I said yes. And they had a meeting, and all the people from Connellsville that had money were there, all of them. And one of them, and I'm trying to think of his name, was a big shot there. And I said to Arsenberger, this guy's not making any sense. Uh, he wanted to put the concessions out for someone else to run. And I said, do you want me to answer this? He said, yeah. I said, you realize one of your biggest profit margins is going to be the concession stand. And the guy said, well, I think you're wrong, and I'm never wrong. And I said, well, when you get home, mark this on your calendar that you were wrong. And he got mad and he left. Many years later, his son raced there, and I'm sorry I can't remember the name of the guy. But anyway, I said to Arsenberger, I said, did I cause you a problem? And he said, nope, guy's an asshole. We didn't want to. So it solved one of their problems. And they ran it for many years, but with five bosses. Oftentimes, boss number one didn't like what boss number four was doing. And you say it was an eye opener? Yes. It could have cured blindness. That's how bad it was. Because I had always wanted to be a promoter based on my dealings working with Don Martin. But after a year, I said, guys, I don't think I want to keep doing this. And Chip Rowan had been a promoter before me, but he had other businesses. So they got Chip to come back and take over when I left. And then I went to Indiana University and eventually became the director of the Career Center for Vocational Education. And I was there for 15 years, which was a really smart move on my part.
Couple of minutes left. Again, we're going to get into more of this as we move on through this series. But uh, tell us where we can hear Rapping on Racing, what it's all about, quick history of Rapping on Racing.
Well, it was on the radio for probably 30 plus years, and now it's a podcast, and people can go to rappingonracing.com. And the nice thing about it being a podcast, I mean, I actually have a listener in Australia. He used to be in the military. And when someone says to me, wow, well, when we were on the radio, if you were more than 100 or 200 miles from Pittsburgh, you couldn't hear it. Like Mike Dutko used to have to sit in his pickup truck in his yard with the truck pointed to a certain tree to get the signal to listen to the show. Well, now you can hear it anywhere in the world. Dave Dragovich listens to it down in Florida.
Yep.
He's
Yep.
he's
I
an
know
avid
people all
listener.
over the country that listen to you, and I happen to know the guy that convinced you to go from a radio show to a podcast, and I think that was a pretty good idea.
Was that your son?
Yep.
Yes. One of the smartest men I have ever met.
Yeah, he reminds me of that all the time. Don, we are going to wrap this up for this time. No promises on when we get to episode number 2. We'd like to do this every week or two. We're going to see how this goes. Again, we're calling this Speeding Through History. We're starting with the master himself. We're going to continue. Don, I want you to pick your own brain for a week or so. Think about some other things you want to talk about, some of the history you've gotten to live through, how many decades of racing for you. And we wrap this up. We thank you for joining us. We're going to do it all again here in just a couple of weeks here on Speeding Through History.
Thank you.